In the blistering heat of room 216, under 47 fluorescent lights and with 23 million students' futures hanging in the balance, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sits stone-faced across from Secretary Marco Rubio as he unveils the School Freedom Act, a plan that slashes public education funding and redirects billions toward private religious schools. But Jasmine isn't here to play politics. She's here to expose a system that calls inequality choice. As cameras roll and the tension cuts like glass, she reaches for a single folder, rises without warning, and changes the trajectory of the entire hearing. What truth did she unleash? That left even Rubio struggling for air. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the blinding fluorescent lights of room 216 of the Rayburn House office building, the air felt less like policy debate and more like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Secretary Marco Rubio, with a crisp navy suit, an American flag pin on his lapel, and a rehearsed smile that flickered with calculated restraint, Rubio cleared his throat and launched into the opening statement for his School Freedom Act. "This is about restoring power to families," he said, his voice steady, polished. "No more one-size-fits-all education. No more children trapped by ZIP codes. The act would reallocate billions from public school systems into private school." Behind him, charts towered on easels, red arrows, green bars, maps of diverted funding. To the press gallery, it was a fresh pitch in an old debate. To the lobbyists seated behind him, it was the first move in a billion-dollar chess game. But on the other side of the room, beneath a sharp sweep of natural light, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat almost statuesque, silent, still, and unmistakably alert. A single black notebook lay open in front of her, pages already filled with looping cursive and heavy underlines. She didn't interrupt. She didn't smirk. She simply watched. Watched as Rubio's fingers tapped twice on the table with every policy point. Watched as GOP lawmakers nodded along like metronomes, synchronized with entitlement. Watched as every sentence was met with applause from the school choice crowd, seated like a jury already told how to vote. Crockett's silence wasn't absence. It was calculation. She was letting them speak uninterrupted, unchallenged, unfiltered. Because when the powerful feel unopposed, they expose more than they conceal. She didn't need a microphone yet. She needed their assumptions. As she later whispered to her aide without looking up, "When they think no one's watching, they tell the truth." And just as the final applause wilted into the static hum of fluorescent lights, the remote in Marco Rubio's hand clicked again, the kind of quiet, confident motion that comes not from truth, but from someone certain they won't be challenged. The projection screen behind him flared to life, revealing a glowing map of the United States riddled with blue pins. They blinked in every corner of the country. Small towns, suburban belts, rural counties, like lights on a battlefield. "These," Rubio announced, gesturing with open palms, "are the institutions leading the future of American education." His voice dipped into something almost reverent. "Faith-based, values-centered, proven environments. These are the schools we're empowering with choice and with funding." Names began scrolling beside the map. St. Gabriel's Academy, Harmony Covenant School, Light of Hope Preparatory. Logos adorned with crosses and doves glided across the screen like a parade of moral superiority. Rubio didn't mention that every single one of them was private, or that 94% were religious, or that not one answered to a democratically elected school board. He continued, unfazed. "For too long, families have been trapped by government bureaucracy, forced to send their children to broken schools simply because of a street address. We are correcting that injustice today." Behind him, the screen zoomed in on specific districts: Houston, Atlanta, Jackson, Mobile. The pins multiplied. The numbers, our federal dollars, surged across the borders of public schools and into gated campuses few poor families could name, let alone enter. Rubio let the image breathe, confident it would speak for itself. But across the room, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, slowly, precisely. She didn't blink. Her fingers flipped to a tab in her notebook marked OCR Report 2025. She raised her hand on just a few inches, and the oxygen seemed to thin. Mr. Secretary, she began, her voice level and clear, could you please read the full list of recipient institutions into the record? The room paused. Rubio hesitated. It was brief, a half-second skip, but enough. One of his aides rushed forward, whispering, sliding a folder onto the table. Rubio cleared his throat and began reading. Trinity Classical Academy, Covenant Gate, St. Jude's Academy of Excellence. It went on. Jasmine listened without interrupting, not because she agreed, but because she was counting. Names, states, patterns. Her silence was not concession. It was the fuse tightening. After 10 names, she spoke again. This time she held up a printed report. Government issued, embossed, and marked Office for Civil Rights. She read without raising her voice, but her words landed like lead. 80% of these institutions, 8 out of every 10, refuse admission to students with disabilities, learning differences, or from households below the federal poverty line. A quiet gasp somewhere in the gallery. The map behind Rubio didn't flicker, but it didn't need to. Its glow was now accusation. Jasmine laid the report flat on her desk and looked at Rubio, then across the dais. And that's when a congressman on Rubio's side broke ranks. Defensive, stern. Families, he said, have the right to choose a moral and safe environment for their children. A few nods followed. Rubio, grateful for the rescue, exhaled. Jasmine did not respond to him, not immediately. Instead, she turned her eyes back to the map, now distorted by meaning. Choice, she said finally, is a beautiful word, but only if you're holding the pen. She looked up. What about the children who were never given that pen? Who were born into ZIP codes that politicians forgot? Into bodies schools refused to accommodate? Into homes faith-based boards deemed too broken for their mission statements? She paused, not for drama, for gravity. What do you call it when a system pretends to offer freedom, while quietly fencing off who gets to access it? And without waiting for an answer, she turned back to her notes. Because in that room, every silence spoke louder than their applause. The silence that followed Jasmine's indictment wasn't rhetorical. It was surgical. It carved through the hearing room like a wire through stone, brittle and deliberate. No one moved. No one breathed. And that's exactly when she struck again. Not with volume, not with fury, but with the quiet precision of evidence. She reached for the panel in front of her and pressed a discreet button. The room darkened slightly as the projection screen lit up once more. But this time, there were no color-coded maps, no polished slogans, no spin, just the slow, unfiltered lens of a handheld camera. And the truth it refused to hide. The frame opened on the warped linoleum floor of James R. Houston Public Middle School in South Dallas. Date stamped just 3 days prior. The hallway looked more like an evacuation zone than an educational space. Missing ceiling tiles, exposed wiring, a lone water fountain with a handwritten sign taped above it, "Do not use contaminated." The camera panned into room 117. 25 students sat in a room designed for 15. The walls were bare, paint peeling like dried skin. In one corner, a fan buzzed uselessly against the Texas heat, and then the camera rested on a boy, maybe 12, standing stiffly at the front of the class. He wore a uniform shirt 2 sizes too big and held in his hands a textbook so tattered it barely had a cover. His voice cracked, not with emotion, but with hesitation, the kind learned from being ignored. "I want to be an engineer," he said, "but our science book says Pluto is still a planet. It was printed before I was born." There was no music, no narration, just the hum of the broken fan and the faint creak of chairs. For 10 seconds, the image froze on the textbook. Foundations of Physical Science, 2004 edition. The spine was held together by duct tape. The corners had been chewed by time or pests. A girl in the background whispered, "We take turns sharing it." Then the screen went black for half a second, before cutting to something that felt like an entirely different world. The next shot opened on manicured lawns, stone arches, and white-pillared gates. St. Enoch's Preparatory Academy, located just 8 miles away, in the same school district. The sunlight glinted off tinted windows and gold-lettered signage. Excellence through faith. The tour footage glided across polished marble floors, through classrooms lined with smartboards and ergonomic seating, past a cafeteria that served almond milk and fresh strawberries. The school's website flashed briefly on screen, followed by a red highlighted figure, $4 million. Recent federal grant. Then came the bombshell. A PDF of the school's admissions guidelines was shown in full. Jasmine's voice narrated quietly off camera. St. Enoch's retains the right to deny enrollment based on behavioral fit, cultural alignment, or family value inconsistencies. Then one final line appeared on the screen, pulled from an investigative report. St. Enoch's rejected 40% of applicants last semester under cultural misalignment. Each word was circled, underlined, documented. No dramatics, no editing, just the juxtaposition. A broken public school teaching outdated science to children born into poverty, and a private religious academy, federally funded, that handpicked its students like club members. The chamber didn't erupt. It contracted, shrinking under the weight of what had just been seen. Even the Republican staffers stared forward, their pens paused midair. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. The screen had already said everything. We are not failing our children by accident. We are choosing to. And then the screen went black. Total stillness returned. Only Jasmine's pen tapped once, sharp and steady against the table. A sound louder than any argument. The screen went dark, but the silence it left behind was anything but empty. It throbbed with indictment, with the weight of all that had been exposed and all that had been ignored for far too long. No one dared reach for their phone. No one dared clear their throat. The hearing room, so often a theater of posturing, had been stripped down to something raw, something unavoidable. And that was when Jasmine Crockett stood. There was no dramatics in her movement, no grand gesture, just quiet authority, the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice because the truth is already roaring behind it. She turned toward the witness table, hands resting lightly on the polished wood before her, and locked eyes with Marco Rubio across the chamber. "Mr. Secretary," she said, her voice steady as stone, "have you ever stepped foot inside a public school in a neighborhood like South Dallas? Not for a photo op, not for a campaign stop. I mean, really stepped inside, where the ceilings leak, where the air conditioning hasn't worked in years, where the same algebra textbook has passed through 5 different generations of hands?" Her tone didn't waver. It didn't need to, because the absence of an answer was already thickening in the air. Rubio shifted slightly, offering the faintest smile. Confident, almost smug, practiced like a signature. "Congresswoman," he said, "I didn't come here to cry over a broken system. I came here to fix it." A beat passed. Crockett didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even change the set of her jaw. But her voice, when it came, was colder now. Not cruel, but crystalline. "You don't fix what you've never funded. You don't get to starve a system, turn your back on it, and then show up with blueprints as if the wreckage wasn't by design." Her eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with precision. "You call it reform. I call it abandonment dressed in policy." Around the room, heads turned. Staffers paused. Even the stenographer hesitated for half a breath. Crockett leaned forward slightly, not to threaten, but to make sure every syllable landed. "You say you didn't come here to cry, but maybe if you had, you'd finally understand why our kids have nothing left to dry their eyes with." The final words of Jasmine Crockett's indictment still vibrated through the hearing chamber like the aftermath of a thunderclap. But she didn't pause for effect. She pivoted. A flick of her hand activated the screen behind her once more, replacing the last emotional blow with something colder, harder. Data. "Let's step away from sentiment," she said calmly, almost clinically, as if peeling off a glove before surgery. "Let's look at what we're actually buying." The lights dimmed slightly as a government-issued seal appeared on screen. GAO, Government Accountability Office, Audit 04-3825. Beneath it, in stark black text, glared the figure that would reshape the room's temperature. 72% of private schools receiving federal school choice funds, failed to meet national academic standards in math, science, or reading comprehension. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. The screen did the shouting for her. Charts filled the frame, column after column of bar graphs detailing student performance, year-over-year comparisons, and federal funding allocations. The tallest red bar, 2025 failure to meet benchmark. Science, grades 7 through 12, towered above all others. A black line traced the increasing flow of money over the last 4 years, climbing steadily while student proficiency lagged or dropped. That, she said, tapping the monitor once with the back of her pen, is the return we're getting for handing out public dollars to unregulated institutions, schools with no elected boards, no transparency requirements, and apparently no obligation to teach reality. The next slide struck even harder. A name flashed in bold white text against a gray background. Cedar Dominion Academy. Federal allocation, $5 million, FY 2024 to 2025. Beneath it, a quote from their official biology curriculum. Students will learn that all life began 6,000 years ago, per the book of Genesis. Evolution is not a fact, but a theory in dispute. Dinosaurs coexisted with early humans before the Great Flood. The silence in the room was no longer respectful. It was stunned. You could feel the tension tighten, breath by breath, as lawmakers on both sides of the aisle shifted in their chairs, unsure whether to look at Jasmine or away from the screen. But she didn't flinch. She walked forward, stopped precisely center stage, and let her voice harden to a gleaming edge. There are students across this country, she said, who are studying by flashlight because their classroom lights don't work, who are learning photosynthesis from pages falling out of a 20-year-old book, who share desks, textbooks, and sometimes meals because their schools are underfunded, overcrowded, and overlooked. She turned her gaze directly to Rubio, her tone not angry but surgical. And yet, you're sending $5 million, our dollars, to a school that teaches theology as biology, to a school that tells children the Flintstones was a documentary. She turned back to the room. What are we funding here? Education? Or a tax-subsidized fantasy camp for the ideologically pure? The screen clicked again, and the image shifted to a composite of more schools, each name paired with a red, flagged label by the Department of Education's now defunded Office of Standards Enforcement. Underneath, in fine print, were notes like, does not offer special education services, no certified science instructor on staff, curriculum not aligned with state benchmarks. Jasmine circled back toward the dais, her footsteps deliberate, her voice slower now, the kind of slow that comes when the blade is being drawn in full view. We are hemorrhaging funds into institutions that get to pick their students, ignore federal guidelines, and still cash the checks. Meanwhile, public schools, real schools, are being forced to run science labs without lab equipment. She gestured upward at the screen again. That's not school choice. That's a rigged game, and the house always wins. Then she stopped, eyes fixed on Rubio. Mr. Secretary, she said, each word crisp as broken glass, do you consider it responsible governance to pour millions into schools that don't teach science, that deny climate change, that tell students the Earth is 6,000 years old? Rubio opened his mouth, but she kept going. Fast, sharp, relentless. Because if that's what we're calling education now, then we owe every child in America an apology, especially the ones who still believe facts are worth fighting for. She held up the GAO report one last time. This isn't a political attack, it's an audit. Your program, your signature reform, is failing by every measurable metric except one: ideological purity. The air tightened as if waiting for a gavel that hadn't yet dropped. You want to talk about freedom? Let's talk about the freedom to learn truth, the freedom to ask questions, study science, debate facts, not parrot dogma because the funding contract says so. Then came the final turn. She pointed once more at the screen, now frozen on Cedar Dominion Academy's Earth Science Overview, which made no mention of tectonic plates, but devoted 2 full units to flood geology and fossilization in Noah's era. Her hand dropped slowly and her gaze locked dead on Rubio's. Are we, the American taxpayers, funding education or underwriting a mass exodus from reality? She paused, just long enough for the weight of it to settle like cement. Is this a school system or a state-sponsored hallucination? There was no applause, no rebuttal, just the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distinct sound of one truth colliding head-on with a nation's illusion. The air in the chamber had thickened to something close to grief, not loud, not chaotic, but slow, suffocating like smoke after a fire. Jasmine Crockett's last words had landed like a final nail in a sealed box, and yet no one moved to pry it open. There was no counterpoint, no pivot to talking points or safe statistics, just the shared discomfort of a room that had been forced to look directly at the machinery of neglect it had helped build. The chairman glanced down at his schedule, cleared his throat almost apologetically, and said with solemn weight, "We now open the floor for public testimony." The doors creaked open behind the dais, not dramatically, but with the sound of something old, rusted, and reluctant. A name was read into the record, and a woman entered, slowly, deliberately, like every step cost her more than she could afford to give. Her name tag read Maria L. Thomas, but she didn't need introduction. She carried with her the quiet authority of someone who had survived things no hearing could ever fully name. She was dressed simply, a clean blouse, wrinkled slacks, cheap flats with worn soles. Not because she didn't care, but because the last time she had an extra $40, she spent it on asthma medication for her son. The mic wavered as she adjusted it. Her hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from exhaustion. She took a single breath, not to center herself, but to push the weight off her chest just long enough to speak. "I work 2 jobs, she began, her voice so soft it made the room lean forward to catch every word. "I clean offices at night. I stock grocery shelves in the morning. I don't say that for pity. I say it because I'm tired of being invisible." She glanced down at the written notes she had scribbled on a grocery receipt, then looked back up with eyes that had long since run out of patience. "I'm a mother, a single mother, and I have spent the last 3 weeks pleading, not applying, pleading, with a private school to accept my son. Not because I believe in their mission, not because I want him to be wrapped in stained glass and chapel bells, but because our public school has nothing left to give." Her voice cracked. She didn't try to hide it. She kept speaking, each word sharper than the one before. "Our school lost its music program last year, then the art teacher, then gym. Now the nurse is gone, replaced by a part-time secretary with a thermometer and a locked drawer labeled medication unavailable. Last month my son had a fever, 103.7. He sat in the hallway for 2 hours with a wet paper towel on his forehead because there was no one qualified to help." She paused, breathing now not just through her lungs but through a wound. "The school can't afford it. That's what they told me. Can't afford a nurse." In the gallery no one moved. A few heads dropped. One aide put their phone face down. The weight of her story was undeniable because it wasn't rare. It was common. That was what made it unbearable. Maria kept going. "And now I'm supposed to celebrate school choice? I'm supposed to smile while I fill out 20-page applications for institutions that ask whether I attend church, what I believe about marriage, what kind of home I raise my child in? And still, they reject him. No reason, just a line in an email, does not meet cultural alignment." A tear slid down her cheek, and she didn't wipe it away. "What does that mean? That we're too poor? Too black? Too public? What culture am I failing to align with? The one where kids get books, or the one where only some of them do?" She clutched the podium now like it was the only thing keeping her from collapse. "I'm not asking for luxury. I'm not asking for privilege. I'm asking for a math class that doesn't cancel mid-year because the teacher had to get a second job. I'm asking for a school nurse, a gym, a song, a place where my son can be more than a number on a wait list." There was a long silence when she finished. Not out of politeness, out of reverence. She didn't walk off the platform. She stepped down like someone returning from a battlefield. Her shoulders slumped slightly, her hands shaking again as she reached for her purse. as if hoping she hadn't just spilled too much of her soul into a room full of suits. And then, as she passed by the witness table, Jasmine Crockett stood, not in grand defiance, not to claim credit. She stood because no one else had, and she walked slowly but surely until she reached the woman whose voice had cracked open the chamber more than any statistic could. She didn't speak. She didn't offer platitudes or slogans or staffer-assigned talking points. She simply placed a hand, firm, grounded human, on Maria's shoulder. It wasn't performative. It wasn't a photo op. It was solidarity, the kind that speaks louder than microphones, louder than news coverage, louder than laws that never make it past committee. It said, "You are not alone in this fight. I see you, I hear you, and I will not look away." That moment, brief, unscripted, quiet, would never appear in the official minutes. But for those in the room, it was the most honest, devastating, and necessary act of the day. The kind of truth no funding formula can bury. The weight of Maria Thomas's testimony still pressed against the chamber walls like an unshakable fog, heavy with the truths no policy brief could neutralize. But silence is a threat to those who rely on structure, and it didn't take long for the machinery of political counterplay to roar back to life. Just as the emotion of the moment threatened to rewrite the entire tone of the hearing, a young aide in a tailored gray suit cut through the hush like a blade. His shoes echoed crisply against the marble floor as he approached the dais with practiced urgency, carrying a thick manila folder pressed tight against his chest. Not evidence, but ammunition. He handed it directly to the chairman, who adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Entering into the record," he intoned, "a submission from the Office of the Secretary, a public letter signed by 1,217 parents representing private and faith-based educational institutions." The screen behind the witness table flickered back to life, and this time it was no longer graphs or audit reports or videos of broken classrooms. Instead, it filled with staged photographs, children in neat uniforms standing in front of crosses, families holding hands in prayer circles outside sun-drenched campuses, teachers with Bibles raised beside the American flag. These weren't statistics. They were symbols, and symbols in the right hands could cut deeper than facts ever would. The letter itself appeared next, oversized, perfectly typeset, under a heading in bold serif font, "In defense of our children's spiritual freedom." The message was unmistakable. It praised the School Freedom Act not for measurable academic outcomes, but for its moral agenda, returning authority to God-fearing parents, shielding students from secular agendas, rescuing our youth from spiritual decay. There was no mention of test scores, dropout rates, or educational parity, but there was fire and righteousness, and the faint scent of manufactured martyrdom. It was politics cloaked in the language of salvation. Then came the voice that pushed the moment into a new arena, one far more treacherous than budgetary debate. A senior Republican congressman, leaning forward in his chair with hands clasped in theatrical solemnity, turned toward Jasmine Crockett. "Congresswoman," he said, his tone sharp but wrapped in diplomatic courtesy, "given your repeated objections to the redirection of federal funds toward faith-based schools, schools chosen freely by thousands of devout families, are you, in effect, opposing religious freedom itself?" The words echoed like a charge being read in a courtroom. Not a question, a trap, designed to reframe the conversation from policy to persecution. A low murmur stirred through the chamber. Cameras swiveled toward Jasmine with a hunger that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with spectacle. And somewhere outside the room, as if on cue, the headlines began to emerge. Breaking, Crockett grilled over religious liberty stance. Another soon followed, Jasmine versus Jesus? Within minutes, screenshots of the moment flooded social media, surgically cropped to show Jasmine mid-expression. No context, just a frame, frozen and weaponized. One tweet read, "Crockett declares war on Christian education." Another, "She wants to tell your pastor how to teach your kids." None of it true, all of it effective. Jasmine remained still, her fingers laced tightly on the table, her posture composed but coiled. She didn't reach for a rebuttal immediately, because she knew this was no longer about her words. It was about how they would be twisted before they even left her mouth. She was being framed not as a legislator, but as an apostate. The accusation wasn't that she failed to protect the budget, it was that she dared to challenge a sacred narrative, one where school vouchers were painted as divine instruments and public education was portrayed as the enemy of faith. She breathed once, slowly, not to center herself, but to push against the tidal wave of distortion forming just beyond the chamber walls. She had seen this move before. It was as old as American politics. Cloak inequity and holiness and condemn those who name it as heretics. The goal wasn't to debate her. It was to exile her from moral legitimacy, to paint her not as a truth teller, but as a threat to the spiritual order, especially in front of cameras that could cut and paste her into any narrative they chose. But Jasmine didn't rise. Not yet, because she understood something they didn't. Silence, when chosen, is not surrender. It is precision. And in that moment, her stillness spoke volumes louder than their sanctimony, because everyone in that room, even those who'd never admit it, knew what this really was: a diversion, a carefully timed sleight of hand to change the subject from a boy sharing a broken science book to a woman who dared to question the cost of ignorance dressed in righteousness. The echo of the congressman's question, "Are you opposing religious freedom?" still hung in the chamber like a lingering stench, manufactured outrage polluting what was once a fact-based inquiry. Jasmine Crockett had not taken the bait. She had let the weight of silence choke the performance until it collapsed under its own theater. And then, in that charged stillness, she moved, not to defend herself, but to deliver a truth so sharp it wouldn't just change the tone of the hearing, it would puncture its very foundation. She reached into the thick leather folio before her, with the slow, deliberate motion of someone about to ignite something irreversible. No rush, no panic, just surgical purpose. "Since we're now discussing intent," she said, her voice cutting cleanly across the room, "I'd like to enter into the record a document provided by a former staffer from the Office of the Secretary." She raised a single page, white, plain, unassuming, and held it in the air like an indictment. The committee clerk stood, eyes widening slightly, as Jasmine handed it over with no flourish. "This," she continued, "is an internal email, marked Confidential Strategy Communication, authored 6 months ago by a senior advisor to Secretary Rubio. It concerns the distribution of federal education funds under the School Freedom Act." At her signal, the projection screen came to life once more, but there were no bar graphs this time, no children in uniforms or families in prayer circles, just black text on a white background, a subject line, funding allocation strategy, priority zones, a timestamp, a signature, and one paragraph, highlighted in yellow, now expanded to fill the screen. Jasmine read it aloud, slowly, clearly, no emotion, just execution. "Ensure the reallocation of federal education grants is targeted toward conservative religious communities, specifically those who delivered turnout for us in the last election. These voters must see tangible returns before the next cycle." Gasps. Not from the gallery, not from aides, from elected officials. Chairs creaked as members leaned in, squinting at the screen, some instinctively glancing at Rubio as if to confirm whether this was real, or if they'd walked into a hearing that had suddenly become a courtroom. Jasmine didn't stop. She lowered the page with care and turned her full attention to Rubio, whose face had lost the practiced stillness he wore like armor. His eyes flickered, not toward Jasmine, but toward his own staff behind him. No one moved, no one offered a rebuttal, no one dared. She stepped closer to the mic, both hands on the desk now. "Let me be absolutely clear," she said, her voice low but resolute. "This wasn't a miscommunication. This wasn't a rogue line from a careless intern. This was a written directive from the highest levels of the Secretary's office, advising that taxpayer funds meant for education be used as political currency, not allocated based on need, not based on a school performance, not even based on capacity, but based on loyalty." She let that word hang there. Loyalty, not learning, not literacy. Loyalty. Is this what we've become? She asked. A nation where children are worth educating only if their parents voted the right way? Where government funding is a reward for ideological obedience instead of a right grounded in the Constitution? No one responded. Because what could they say? The document was still glowing on the screen, undeniable in its clarity, damning in its honesty. The very thing they had accused her of, injecting ideology into education, was now exposed as the actual operating policy of the office she was questioning. Rubio opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came. His hand twitched toward his glass of water. He lifted it halfway, then set it down without drinking. His expression was no longer confident. It was tight, controlled, the face of a man calculating damage, not delivering vision. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, not in arrogance, but in astonishment. You stood here for an hour, she said, telling us this was about freedom, about faith, about saving children from broken systems, and now we find out it's about turnout? Her voice hardened, sharpened. You didn't save anyone. You bought silence. You redirected resources away from the voiceless to appease the already empowered, and you did it with our money. Behind her, aides were frantically typing. Reporters were already drafting headlines, but Jasmine wasn't done. There are schools, she continued, where kids are sitting in unheated buildings using textbooks older than they are, where teachers are buying paper with their own salaries, where the only counselor for 1,000 students also serves as the lunch monitor. And yet those schools didn't make your priority zone list, not because they're unworthy, but because they're inconvenient, because their communities didn't vote for you. She gestured again to the screen. That's not just corrupt, it's cruel, and it should disqualify any claim you've made about fairness, faith, or future. The chamber was silent again, but this time not out of tension, out of stunned recognition. The kind of silence that only follows after truth has broken through denial like glass. The kind of silence that precedes collapse. And Jasmine Crockett, still standing, didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply leaned forward and spoke with finality. This isn't about religion. This isn't about reform. This is about rigging the game, and now the country sees it. The chamber had just endured the kind of silence that follows a moral collapse. Not because the truth hadn't been known, but because it had finally been made undeniable. Undeniable enough to print, to share, to chant. Outside the marble walls of the Capitol, the reaction had already begun. First in murmurs, then in motion. Teachers still in lanyards and tennis shoes, college students wrapped in protest banners, single mothers holding hands with children wearing paper signs. They filled the steps like a rising tide. News choppers buzzed overhead. Reporters with hastily inked press passes lined the fences. Someone began to chant, "Fund our futures, not your donors." It spread quickly, echoing against stone pillars and metal barricades. From street level, it looked like a movement, but from inside that chamber, it sounded like a reckoning. Back within those walls, Jasmine Crockett remained silent, not because she had nothing left to say, but because she had already said what needed to be said. With every chart, every quote, every name that had been left out of Rubio's glowing maps, she had peeled back the glossy facade of choice to reveal the systemic exclusion beneath. And now, in the most deafening moment of the entire hearing, she did not reach for her mic. She reached for a single sheet of paper, folded once, creased at the corners, hand-drawn in black ink, and the quiet fury of someone who knew what it meant to be locked out. She stood. The room turned toward her. Even the most calloused faces, those who had spent decades in Washington untouched by outrage, seemed to feel the pull of the moment. She didn't walk to the front. She didn't speak to the crowd. She simply raised the paper in both hands and held it high, directly in the path of every camera, every lens, every lie waiting to be edited. It wasn't data. It wasn't policy. It was a drawing, a single student, faceless, featureless, but unmistakably a child, standing at a fork in the road. On one side, a building in ruin, windows shattered, a door with chains and a handwritten sign, "Closed due to budget cuts." On the other side, a towering gate, pristine and ornate, with golden lettering above it, "Admission by selection." The room did not erupt. It folded into a silence so tight it became unbearable. That image, oh, so simple, so direct, said what hours of debate could not. It was a portrait of every child who had been told they weren't quite the right fit. Every student whose zip code became their destiny. Every parent who had been forced to watch a broken system blame them for failing to survive it. Jasmine didn't point to the drawing. She didn't explain it. She didn't have to. The truth had become self-evident. And in that moment, it wasn't about Democrat or Republican, religion or science. It was about which children got a key and which were left at the gate. One lawmaker shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Another cleared her throat and looked away. Rubio sat motionless, lips tight, hands clenched, the weight of what had been exposed pressing down on the polished oak of his testimony. For all the data, the millions in funding, the ornate rhetoric about freedom, no one could look away from that image because it showed the outcome, not the theory, not the promise, the outcome. Outside, the chants grew louder. Signs rose higher. Books not barriers. Kids not quotas. Faith and fairness, not favoritism. It no longer sounded like protest. It sounded like truth, shouted out loud by those who had gone unheard for too long. Jasmine lowered the paper slowly, like the final act of a trial where the jury no longer needed convincing. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Because somewhere between the silence inside and the roar outside, the balance had shifted. And everyone in that room knew it. The cameras caught it all. Not the sound bites, not the bickering, but the stillness of power in the hands of someone who had never needed to lie to make her point. And though the hearing wasn't yet adjourned, and though the vote hadn't yet been taken, the decision, the moral verdict, had already been delivered. Not through legislation, through clarity, through contrast, through one hand-drawn truth held higher than any political performance could reach. And Jasmine? She said nothing. Because the moment didn't belong to her, it belonged to Malik, to Maria, to the thousands standing outside, to the child in the drawing, the one left at the gate, the one who would never again be invisible, the image of the child at the fork in the road, torn between a shuttered public school and a gleaming private gate labeled admission by selection, remained seared into the conscience of the room long after Jasmine lowered the page. No further explanation had been needed. That silent act had pulled the final thread on a facade already unraveling. The hearing wasn't officially over, but the air had changed. Even the most jaded observers could feel it. The balance had tipped. What had begun as a polished unveiling of Marco Rubio's School Freedom Act had, over hours of piercing cross-examination and blistering evidence, transformed into a reckoning not just of policy, but of values. Jasmine Crockett had not screamed. She had not pleaded. She had simply revealed, and what she revealed wasn't just numbers or leaked memos. It was the soul of the system itself, stripped bare in the public eye. A long pause settled before the chairman finally leaned forward, his fingers templed beneath his chin. His voice, when it came, was quieter than expected, like a man realizing he had to dig his way back to principle. In light of the new documents presented, including the GAO compliance data, the video testimonies, and the internal email from the Secretary's office, he said, this committee will suspend further action on the School Freedom Act. His words were deliberate, pending a full review and ethical audit of its development and distribution plans. No gavel came. It didn't need to. The chamber heard the verdict in the silence that followed. A pin could have shattered the tension. On Rubio's side of the bench, aides sank slightly in their chairs, avoiding eye contact with one another. Aides from both parties reached for their phones, some already texting updates to senior staff. Rubio himself sat stiffly, hands clutched in front of him. The practiced smile from earlier now melted into something distant, the look of a man who had followed the script only to realize the stage was gone. Outside, the crowd that had gathered during the hearing, a coalition of teachers in worn hoodies, parents still wearing cafeteria aprons, college students with protest slogans etched across cardboard, erupted. But not with the chaos of victory, with the relief of being seen. Signs that had sagged in the sun now rose again. Someone shouted, "Justice for our classrooms!" And the chant caught fire. "Justice for our classrooms!" Again, louder, until it became a drumbeat. And for the first time all day, Capitol Security did not try to silence them. Back inside, Jasmine didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply lowered her hand, folded the page, and returned it to her binder. Because this wasn't a celebration. This wasn't a battle won. It was a pause, a breath drawn between storms. And yet the press didn't wait. As soon as the chairman adjourned the hearing, reporters surged through the corridor, microphones raised like bayonets. Producers barked questions into earpieces. Anchors rehearsed sound bites for their evening leads. The phrase, "bill suspended," was already scrolling across news tickers nationwide. Crockett exposes school funding scandal. Act halted in shock committee. Twist, was it all a political payback scheme? Jasmine exited not through the front entrance, but through a side corridor known to Hill veterans. A hallway lined with forgotten bus and chipped tile, untouched by the frenzy of cameras. Her staff flanked her closely, offering her silence instead of praise. They knew her well enough not to speak yet, but the press found her anyway. A young journalist, barely older than Malik, sprinted from a side elevator and caught up to her just as she neared the exit stairs. He was winded, sweat shining across his temple, but his recorder was steady. "Congresswoman Crockett," he called, his voice cracking from urgency. "Do you consider this hearing a victory?" The question, so basic, so prepackaged, sliced through the hallway like a stray shot. Jasmine stopped walking. The hallway froze with her. She didn't turn. She didn't shift. Her eyes remained fixed forward, past the worn marble, past the security guards, past the sunlight bleeding in from the columns outside. She let the silence stretch, not as a stall, but as a statement. Then she said it, softly, without facing the recorder, without adjusting her tone for the media. "If Malik gets to learn chemistry tomorrow," she whispered, "then I haven't lost yet." The words didn't just echo, they landed, like a stone dropped into a placid lake, sending ripples through every camera feed and comment section, waiting for something dramatic. And they weren't a quote easily cut up into a viral headline. They were heavier than that. They required understanding. They required context. They required listening. Something Washington rarely did. Jasmine kept walking, not toward a podium, but toward the daylight. And still, she didn't let go of the binder. She knew this wasn't over. Hearings get delayed, evidence gets buried, investigations get quietly redirected. Rubio might not be done. His donors certainly weren't. Lobbyists with faith-based funding structures would be knocking on doors by morning. The School Freedom Act might rise again under a new name, with new language and a different face. But now it would rise under scrutiny, because Jasmine had pulled the curtain back, not just on a policy, but on the assumptions propping it up. She stepped through the final threshold and into the open air. A cheer broke out from the protest line the moment they saw her. The noise grew. Some shouted her name. Others held up the image she'd drawn. The forked path, the locked school, the gilded gate. One little girl, no older than 10, waved a hand-drawn sign that read, "I want a future too." Jasmine smiled. Not wide, not performative. Just enough to acknowledge the moment. Enough to say, "I see you." But she didn't stop, because chemistry class starts at 8:10 in South Dallas, and Malik still doesn't have a lab. The crowd slowly began to scatter, but the weight in the air did not. Even as chants softened and the sun began to dip behind the Capitol dome, the fire Jasmine had ignited refused to dim. But the battle cry had passed. What remained now was quieter, more dangerous. The silence where reflection settles. And Jasmine knew. That was where the real test began. You could rouse a nation for a moment, but would they stay awake? She sat alone now on the concrete bench behind the East Wing. No cameras, no staff, just the hum of distant traffic and the faint echo of children's voices from a nearby school tour. Her binder sat unopened beside her. She stared ahead, not at the horizon, but at the questions hanging in the stillness. Because change, she had learned, doesn't come just from confrontation. It comes from meaning, from understanding why the fight matters, especially when no one's watching. Her mind drifted, not to policy or numbers or sound bites, but to Malik, to the way he had looked down when he spoke, to how carefully he had turned the brittle pages of his 2004 science textbook as if it might fall apart if he opened it too wide, to the way he asked her, "Do engineers have to know calculus?" As if dreaming were already a luxury. And that was the lesson no act of Congress could ever legislate, that the real theft wasn't just of books or teachers or HVAC units. It was the theft of imagination, of potential, of belief. Jasmine had faced sharp tongues and cold stares before. She'd been called too loud, too angry, too political. But what she'd never get used to was watching a child lower their voice. Not because they were shy, but because they had learned that dreams draw punishment. That hope is fragile, that if you expect too much, you risk too much. And that in America, the wrong ZIP code teaches you that lesson by the third grade. She inhaled deeply, the weight of that truth tightening across her chest. Every law she fought, every budget she dissected, it all came back to that single, unbearable image, a child apologizing for wanting more. That was the moment Jasmine understood something no Harvard degree or committee chair could teach. This fight wasn't really about schools. It was about worth, about who gets to feel seen, and who's told they're invisible unless they become exceptional. And even then, only maybe. She had grown up in a working-class neighborhood where ambition was seen as both a gift and a threat, where teachers worked 2 jobs and still bought markers out of pocket, where kids shared textbooks with missing pages like they were smuggling contraband, where success stories were whispered like rumors because they were rare enough to still feel unreal. She had escaped the statistics, but she had never escaped the memory. And now as she sat beneath the shadow of the Capitol, a building older than the Civil War but still unable to pass laws to give every child a working bathroom, she realized something else. Justice doesn't come from winning arguments. It comes from remembering pain without turning away, and carrying it into rooms where others would rather forget it. Her phone buzzed. Dozens of missed calls, texts, offers to speak on cable shows that evening. But she let it ring. Because this moment, this quiet moment, held more truth than any broadcast. The humanitarian lesson wasn't wrapped in applause or headlines. It was raw. It was intimate. And it demanded something far harder than outrage. Empathy. She remembered the mother who testified, voice cracking, about begging a private school to accept her son because his public school had cut music, gym, and nurses. Jasmine had touched her shoulder as she left the witness stand, not as a politician, but as a woman who understood what desperation and dignity looked like. That gesture didn't pass legislation, but it mattered, because in a world addicted to distance, human closeness was rebellion. She stood now, binder in hand again, and looked across the field toward the clusters of volunteers cleaning up protest signs. One young man knelt in the grass, carefully folding each poster instead of tossing them. He didn't notice her watching, and she didn't interrupt, because this quiet act of respect was what real change looked like. Not grandstanding, not outrage, care, intentional, invisible care. That was the lesson, that every budget cut had a name behind it. Every denied application was a face. Every shuttered library was a lost voice. And if you forgot that, if you turned people into talking points, you were no better than the lawmakers who built Golden Gates while leaving classrooms to rot. Jasmine had faced down billionaires in hearings. She had dissected corporate tax loopholes on live TV. But nothing had ever tested her more than sitting across from Malik, trying to answer the question, will things get better? Because the answer, the real one, wasn't yes or no, it was, only if we make them. And that was the hardest truth of all. Progress wasn't a promise, it was a choice. Repeated, fought for, paid for. She looked up at the Capitol dome one last time that afternoon and said quietly, "Let them call me radical. Let them say I make too much noise. As long as Malik learns calculus one day, they can call me whatever they want." Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just fighting policy, She was fighting despair. And some days, the most revolutionary thing you can do is believe anyway. The sunlight didn't cleanse the fight off her shoulders. If anything, it lit it sharper. Jasmine Crockett stepped down the Capitol stairs not like a victor, but like a messenger still carrying unfinished business. And though the chants roared behind her and hands reached out to brush against her blazer sleeve, she didn't stop to wave. Not yet, not until the next step was clear. Because no matter what the headlines would say tonight, she knew the system wouldn't collapse from a single hearing. It had scaffolding too old, too reinforced, too wrapped around the necks of those it claimed to serve. And the truth, no matter how powerful, was only a spark unless someone moved toward the fire. She turned at the bottom of the marble steps. Cameras followed. Protesters quieted. It wasn't planned. It wasn't staged. It was something heavier. A kind of silence that asks, "What now?" And Jasmine answered with her eyes first. Steel, not softness. Then with her voice rising over the crowd like a warning bell. "This is not the end," she said, no microphone needed. "This is the beginning of exposure, the beginning of resistance. But beginnings die when people go home and let comfort replace conviction." Her voice cracked like a whip against the heat. "So don't go home." The crowd tensed forward, magnetized by something beyond anger. Something like responsibility. Jasmine stepped up onto the stone barrier, binder in hand, wind pushing strands of hair across her cheek. She didn't flinch. "If you're a teacher," she called, "then tell the truth. Tell them your school is crumbling. Tell them what it feels like to buy your own paper and still be blamed when a child can't read." Heads nodded. A woman in a cafeteria apron wept silently behind a banner that read, "Fund use like you fund war." Jasmine's voice sharpened. "If you are a student, document everything. The missing books, the mold, the broken fans, because the people voting on your future have never set foot in your present." She turned slowly, scanning the crowd. "If you are a parent, don't just write to Congress. Write to your neighbor. Write to your church. Ask why a school that takes your tax dollars can reject your child because they don't fit the culture." Her voice dropped for a beat, then hit again like thunder. "And when they call that freedom, you ask them, whose freedom? Because freedom that builds gates while tearing down bridges is not freedom. It's theft." A wave of gasps and claps broke through. Jasmine didn't pause. She was lit from inside now, the words not read from paper, but from lived fury. "They want you tired. They want you cynical. They want you afraid to speak because the moment you speak, they lose control of the narrative." Her voice climbed. "So speak louder, march longer, organize harder." She pointed to the Capitol dome behind her. "That building doesn't belong to them. It belongs to us, and it is not patriotic to be quiet when the people inside it forget their oath to every child." The crowd had shifted from passive supporters to something else, something charged. Jasmine turned to a boy near the front, holding a poster with Malik's quote, "My book is from 2004. She pointed directly at it. "This system doesn't fail by accident. It fails by design. Because if you keep a child uneducated long enough, they grow into an adult you can control. Underpaid, over-policed, and too tired to fight." Her voice now was molten. "But if that child learns to think, to question, to dream, then one day they'll take your place at that table. And that's what terrifies them." The crowd roared, but Jasmine wasn't finished. She took a breath, steady and deep. "You saw it today. You saw how quickly the mask falls when you shine a light on the backroom deals. An email, one email, changed the course of this bill, not because I was louder, but because I was prepared. So get prepared. Learn how the money moves. Find out who sits on the school board. Show up to the meetings. Run for them if you have to." She stepped down from the barrier, boots hitting the pavement like a judge's gavel. "Because if we wait for them to fix it, they never will." Jasmine paused, now just feet from the front line of parents and teachers. Her next words were almost a whisper, but somehow carried clearer than any before. "I don't need a statue. I don't need a headline. But I need Malik to have a chemistry lab. I need Maria to go to gym class without praying she doesn't faint from heat." I need kids in Alabama, in Compton, in Flint to have futures not determined by zip code or donation records. She looked skyward for half a second. This isn't a partisan fight. This is a moral one. And if we don't win it, we'll answer for that silence every time a child is left behind. The applause rose like thunder, but Jasmine didn't wait for it to finish. She moved through the crowd, shaking hands, hugging strangers. Some cried. Some just held eye contact as if to say, "Finally someone sees us." A retired principal pressed a handwritten note into her palm. Names of 4 schools closed in the last year. Jasmine folded it without reading. "I'll get to them," she promised. "All of them." Reporters swarmed again, shouting questions. "Will you introduce a counterbill? Are you calling for Rubio to resign? What's next for your campaign?" But Jasmine didn't break stride. She simply turned one last time before disappearing behind the barricade and said, "Next, you are." Because the truth was out now, and truth, once seen, can't be unseen. The real question was whether people would choose the discomfort of action or the comfort of complicity. Because somewhere in America, a bell would ring tomorrow morning, and somewhere else, a classroom would stay locked. Which future would it be? And who will fight for the difference? But after the chants faded and the cameras packed up, something unusual happened. People stayed. Not all, not most, but enough. Enough to matter. They didn't leave the Capitol steps like tourists or activists ticking a box. They lingered like witnesses, as if the truth they had just heard couldn't be unheard, and now demanded something more. A teacher handed out blank postcards for writing testimonies to their state boards. A student group formed a text chain called Books Before Barriers. A father of 3, who hadn't said a word all day, stood alone near the barricades, holding a cardboard sign he'd scribbled with shaking hands. "My kids deserve better." Inside, long after most lawmakers had vanished down private hallways, a janitor paused in the empty hearing room, staring at the drawing Jasmine had left behind, the child at the crossroads. He didn't touch it. He just stood there, mop still in hand, as if recognizing something personal in that lonely figure, with 2 futures and no voice. And somewhere in South Dallas, a boy named Malik finished his homework beneath the flickering kitchen light, using a textbook older than he was. His mother told him he was smart. He didn't answer. He just looked at the cover and whispered, "I hope they listen." That night, Jasmine Crockett didn't write a press release. She didn't post a video. She didn't call a donor. She wrote Malik a letter, not to inspire him, but to remind herself why she could not afford to stop. Because policies might pass or die in silence. But people, especially children, carried the outcome in their lives, in their futures, and in the quiet moments when they dared to hope someone, somewhere, was still fighting for them. And that's where the revolution really begins. Not in the hearings, but in the homes that no one ever tours. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Inside a stormy congressional hearing in Washington, D.C., Senator Katie Britt and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett clash over one burning issue. Should public welfare be expanded to protect struggling families, or is it fueling national dependence? Katie argues with fire and conviction, painting a picture of broken incentives and wasted money. But just minutes later, Jasmine shifts the entire narrative, unveiling stories, faces, and hidden truths that no one in that room was prepared to confront. When the system punishes the poor and rewards the powerful, who really deserves to be on trial? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the blinding lights of the House Oversight Chamber, the chairman leaned forward, his gavel gripped like a weapon of finality. 3 deliberate strikes silenced the murmurs, snapping every camera and eye to full attention. "This hearing," he announced, voice resonating through wood-paneled walls, "is convened to address the proposed expansion of the federal welfare budget, a plan met with fierce resistance by several members of this body." The air turned electric. Screens around the room displayed stark charts, a 12% increase in housing assistance, expanded Medicaid eligibility, and emergency food security grants. We are not just debating dollars, the chairman said coldly. We are deciding whether the poor in America deserve to live with dignity or with delay. That's when she arrived. Katie Britt stepped into the hearing like a prosecutor walking into a sentencing. Her blazer was crisp, her posture militant. She moved straight to the microphone, didn't wait for permission. Let's be clear, she said, her southern drawl edged with steel. We cannot and will not print money to feed dependency. The sentence dropped like a gavel of its own. Gasps rippled. Some on her side smirked. Others scribbled notes furiously. But across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, unmoved in full silence. Not from weakness, but from calculation. Her hands rested on a thick stack of files. Real paper, not numbers. Eviction notices, pharmacy receipts, letters from desperate parents and dying patients. Her eyes met Britt's. She didn't speak, not yet. But in that moment, surrounded by data, judgment, and double standards, Jasmine sat like a fuse waiting to ignite, and then, with a coolness that only years of political rehearsal could perfect, Katie Britt leaned forward and let the data do her dirty work. The room dimmed in mood, though the light stayed bright. She clicked her remote. A towering digital chart exploded onto the screen behind her, red bars stretching ominously upward. Let's deal in facts, she began, voice like ice over steel. In just 5 years, federal spending on entitlement programs, food assistance, Medicaid, public housing, has surged by 34%. Her tone was measured, but beneath its calm lived condemnation. She turned slightly, letting the numbers loom behind her like a wall no one had permission to question. We are spending more now than at any point in the past 2 decades, she continued, not because we're solving poverty, but because we're institutionalizing it. A ripple of discomfort passed through the chamber. Jasmine didn't move, but the tremor was real, and Katie knew it. She pivoted, flipping to a specific page in her binder. The movement slow, theatrical, like peeling back a curtain. Let me give you a name, she said, holding up a file with large black redactions and bold stamped dates. This woman, 32 years old, no job, no attempt at job training, 5 years on federal support. She receives housing assistance, SNAP benefits, and full Medicaid coverage. Britt's voice dropped just slightly, enough to inject scorn beneath the surface. And yet, no community service, no educational progress, no record of seeking employment. Nothing. Zero. She closed the file with a sharp thud and looked up. Her next sentence was not shouted. It didn't have to be. It came slow and cruel. This system doesn't inspire growth. It rewards stagnation. It pays people to give up. A chill fell over the room, like a shadow cast by an invisible hand. The statement didn't explode. It lingered sour and heavy, like smoke in the lungs. Some nodded. Others looked down. But Jasmine Crockett stayed still, her expression unchanged. Not out of shock, but because she'd heard this narrative before, weaponized like clockwork. She saw the game, reduce an entire nation of strugglers to one decontextualized example. Pretend a single mother's pain was policy abuse. Pretend suffering was laziness. Her silence now was no retreat. It was restraint. Because buried in her binder, in the pages still untouched, were names Katie wouldn't dare say, stories she wouldn't dare confront. And Jasmine knew, the deeper the wound, the quieter the burn, until it erupts. But silence has limits. And in a room filled with polished suits, scripted outrage, and cold statistics, Jasmine Crockett had no intention of remaining quiet any longer. She rose with measured stillness, not the kind that fades into the background, but the kind that demands a room to stop breathing. Her hands were steady as she moved toward the screen. She didn't look at Katie Britt. She didn't need to. This wasn't a rebuttal, it was a reckoning. I've heard enough about dependency, she said, her voice low and composed, but edged like a blade. Now let's talk about survival. She opened her binder, thick with stories and documents. Not charts, not theories, but the kind of evidence that bleeds. I want to introduce you to someone who isn't a statistic. She's a citizen, a wife, a worker, a woman your policies have forgotten. The screen behind her blinked to life. A dimly lit photograph appeared, grainy, unfiltered, raw. It showed an elderly black woman sitting at a reception desk, her hands folded over a yellow notepad, her back slightly hunched from decades of labor. She wore a faded motel uniform. A plastic name tag hung loosely from her collar. May Turner. Her eyes looked tired, but not broken, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and kept going anyway. Jasmine let the image linger. "This is May," she said. "She's 72 years old. She works the night shift at a roadside motel in South Dallas. 5 nights a week, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., she checks in guests, changes sheets when housekeeping doesn't show up, and empties trash cans to avoid calling maintenance." The screen shifted to a scanned copy of a pay stub. Jasmine didn't need to read it. She had memorized it. She makes $873 a month. That's before taxes, before she pays for bus fare, before she buys food, before she buys insure for her husband, who's been paralyzed since his second stroke 3 years ago. She turned the page in her binder, her hands slow and deliberate. Now let's talk about why she's still working. Because the man she loves, the man she married 48 years ago, needs 6 different prescriptions a month just to keep breathing. The next slide was not a chart. It was a scanned image of a single pharmacy receipt. $2,173.46 typed in bold at the bottom. Several lines of medications filled the page. The screen paused there. No music, no motion, just the stark reality of what survival costs in America. $2,173.46, Jasmine repeated. That's what it takes each month to keep him alive. Not to heal him, not to improve his condition, just to hold off the end. She looked up. She applied for Medicaid because no insurance company would touch a man over 70 with 2 strokes and a lifetime of poverty behind him. Jasmine walked back to the microphone, eyes scanning the faces in front of her. She was denied. She let the words hang in the air, heavy and bitter. Denied because her income was $60 over the threshold. A beat, no movement, no breath. She flipped to the final page. The denial letter. It was projected behind her. The words "income exceeds state limit" underlined in red. $60, she said again, this time slower, as if repeating it might force someone, anyone, to process the absurdity of what they'd heard. "Let me put this plainly," she continued. "May earns less in a month than most of you spend on valet parking. She hasn't taken a vacation in 15 years. She doesn't own a car. She walks 5 blocks to the bus every day. And yet this government, our government, told her she makes too much to deserve help." Jasmine's voice rose slightly, but it wasn't anger. It was grief sharpened into precision. She works while watching the man she loves slowly disappear. And we call that self-reliance. The room was paralyzed, as if frozen in a collective state of disbelief. Aides lowered their pens. Reporters stared at their laptops, fingers hovering but not typing. No one looked at Jasmine directly. Not yet. Because the moment demanded more than acknowledgement. It demanded guilt. Jasmine stepped forward, her voice quieter now, but more dangerous than ever. "Do you know what May told me?" she asked, her tone dropping to almost a whisper. "She said, I thought if I worked hard, they'd help me when I got old. But I guess I didn't get old the right way." Jasmine paused, let that settle. What is the right way to be poor in America? Quiet, invisible, grateful for crumbs? She turned to the committee. Her gaze moved from chair to chair like crosshairs. What part of this equation says she's safe? What line item says she's not poor? She walked back to the center of the hearing room, binder still in hand. This is what happens when we treat poverty like a personality trait and not a systemic failure. This is what happens when we define dignity by a number on a spreadsheet. Her next words came with the weight of an entire community behind them. Who here, who in this room, believes that $60 makes May Turner rich? No one answered. They didn't need to, because in that moment everyone already knew. The silence was the confession. The silence following Jasmine Crockett's question still hung in the air like gunpowder smoke, undisturbed, unresolved, and undeniable. But then, with a stiffness that betrayed no emotion, Katie Britt slowly rose to her feet. Her eyes didn't flinch. Her posture was erect, disciplined, deliberate, as though she'd spent her entire life preparing for rooms just like this. Marble-lined, high-ceilinged, and split between empathy and disdain. With both hands planted firmly on the wooden table in front of her, she drew in a breath and spoke with a calm that almost sounded noble, until you listened closer. "We didn't come here to attack the poor," she began, her voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "But if we won't say the truth in this room, then where will we say it?" A few nods from her side of the aisle followed. Encouragement. Permission. She turned slightly, glancing toward the gallery, and then aimed her next words not at Jasmine Crockett, but at every camera broadcasting live. "What we're seeing is not compassion gone wrong. It's incentive gone toxic. It's a system that tells people, no matter how hard you work, someone who doesn't will get more." She let the sentence breathe for half a beat, just long enough to hang like a threat. Then she pivoted to her story. "I want to bring this closer to home," she said, gesturing toward the projection screen. "Two families, same zip code, same school district, 5 blocks apart in Mobile, Alabama." The screen lit up with 2 case files, anonymized but paired side by side. Family a father of 3. He works 42 hours a week at a local gas station. Nights he drives a delivery van for an independent contractor. His wife babysits part-time when she can. They file their taxes. They obey the law. They applied for benefits, Medicaid, housing assistance, SNAP, and were denied. Why? Because they make just over the threshold. Not enough to live, just enough to be excluded. Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. The silence in the room amplified every word. She turned to the second file. Family B, no employment history for the past 5 years. The mother receives full housing subsidy, SNAP benefits, and utility assistance. 3 meals a day come from federal aid. Her rent, paid. Her health care, covered. Then Katie looked up, her voice dropping to something quieter, colder. She doesn't work, doesn't apply, and there is no penalty, not even a question. She shut the folder in front of her with a firm, deliberate snap. "So, you tell me," she said, her gaze sweeping across the panel. "What message does that send to the father working 2 jobs just to stay behind?" She paused, perfectly timed, perfectly still, allowing the weight of her argument to settle like a stone on everyone's chest. When the system offers more to those who do less, it doesn't just fail the taxpayers. It betrays the very dignity of labor itself. There it was, her kill shot, dignity. A word that sounded noble, but here, wielded like a blade. From across the room, Jasmine didn't move, but her pulse didn't have to spike for her to feel the temperature change. She recognized the tactic. Pit pain against pain. Tell one person's struggle by erasing another's. Hold up a contrast, ignore the context, and let that false equivalence become a weapon of policy. But Jasmine said nothing. Not yet, because Britt had made one critical error. She had assumed that the absence of work meant the absence of worth. And Jasmine Crockett knew exactly how to answer that mistake, with fire. But first she let Britt's story echo, because soon she would make the room hear a very different kind of truth. The words had barely left Katie Britt's mouth when Jasmine Crockett rose. Not out of reflex, but purpose. The room had felt the chill of Britt's carefully curated contrast, but now it was about to feel heat. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The power in her tone came not from volume, but from restraint, from knowing exactly what it meant to carry the weight of the voiceless. She stepped forward with the deliberate control of someone who had spent a lifetime hearing her people reduced to footnotes in a budget debate. "Let's be honest," she began, her voice steady, almost quiet, like thunder before it hits. "Welfare isn't a reward. It's not a gold star. It's not a paycheck for laziness." She paused, making sure every word hit like a gavel. "It's a life vest, something you hand to someone after you've already pushed them out of the boat and then turned around and asked why they can't swim." Her hands were still, her spine straight, Her eyes scanned the room like a witness delivering testimony at a trial where the guilty sat in judgment. You want to talk about incentives? Let's talk about survival. With a slow, almost reverent motion, she reached down and retrieved a folder, slimmer than the one that held Mrs. Turner's story, but no less potent. She opened it, pulled out a single photograph, and held it aloft. No projector, no digital enhancement, just raw truth printed on paper. It was the image of a little girl, no more than 6 years old, sitting on the worn linoleum floor of a food pantry. Her knees were drawn to her chest. A plastic bowl sat in front of her with a spoon too big for her tiny hand. Her hair was pulled back in a crooked ponytail, and her eyes, wide, sunken, unblinking, stared straight into the camera, not with fear, but with exhaustion, the kind of look a child should never have to wear. This, Jasmine said, holding the photo higher so the gallery could see, is Marisol. She turned to the committee. Her mother works sporadically, 2 nights a week at a diner when she can find someone to watch her. There's no fixed income, no daycare, no support system. She paused again, then added quietly, no father. He died in detention, waiting on a hearing that never came. The air shifted. Even the cameras seemed to lean in closer. This picture was taken at 6:42 a.m., Jasmine continued, her voice now razor sharp, because that's when the community pantry opens, and if you wait until 7:15, the oatmeal's gone. The volunteers know her by name, not because it's charming, but because she's been there 3 times this week. She let the silence stretch, then lowered the photo and placed it gently on the table in front of her. Her next words came with no dramatic pause, just precision. Is this what you call stagnation? She turned fully to Britt now, not with fury, but with the unshakable presence of someone who no longer cared about civility when justice was bleeding. Is this the child you're talking about when you say the system rewards idleness? When you show graphs and ratios and anonymous files? Is this who you mean? Because she's not a dependency statistic. She's a 6-year-old, and the only thing she depends on is the kindness of strangers who don't carry a government title. Her voice dipped lower, not softer, heavier. She doesn't need discipline. She needs breakfast. Jasmine held still for a breath, letting her words do what numbers never could. So I ask you all, every person sitting in this room, look at her and tell me, is she what you mean when you say the system's broken? Her eyes swept the room once more. Or is the system broken because a child like this needs charity to eat while we argue whether her mother deserves to live? She stepped back, the silence around her thick and absolute. No one moved, no one dared. Because in that moment, Jasmine Crockett hadn't given a speech. She had broken the frame. She had taken a weapon aimed at the poor and turned it around, slow, deliberate, and undeniable, and aimed it right back at the hands that had thrown it. The room was still holding its breath from the image of Marisol, the 6-year-old girl surviving on donated oatmeal. But Jasmine knew pity alone wouldn't change a system built on polished lies. So she reached for something colder than sympathy. Proof. With slow precision, Jasmine pulled a thick, charcoal-colored folder from beneath her stack of constituent letters. She didn't slam it on the table. She didn't raise her voice, but the weight of that folder and what it contained shifted the room like the drop in air pressure before a coming storm. She held it up to the microphone with both hands and announced, I respectfully request to submit a document most of you in this room have never read, and I suspect many of you hope no one ever would. The title was printed in blunt serif, GAO Audit, Fiscal Disbursements to Fortune 500 Entities, FY 2023. The screen behind her lit up. A slow-loading PDF opened in real time as if even the technology knew what was coming next would hurt. 20 company logos appeared in rows. Amazon, Walmart, Chevron, Pfizer, Lockheed Martin, FedEx, Tyson Foods, and more, each accompanied by a number in bold red font. Jasmine didn't blink. These are the beneficiaries of what I call America's real welfare system, and it has nothing to do with food stamps or Medicaid. She paused, then continued, her tone like a lit fuse. These companies, the top 20, received over $1.2 billion in federal tax breaks and subsidies last year alone. She began to walk slowly toward the center of the hearing room, heels echoing across the polished wood. Let's break that down. Walmart, America's largest private employer, a company worth hundreds of billions. Their workers earn so little that over 300,000 of them qualify for public assistance just to feed their families. So the government, you and me, steps in with food stamps, Medicaid, and housing aid, not for the workers' sake, but because Walmart refuses to pay a living wage. Click. Next slide. A map appeared showing red dots across the U.S. Government supplemented wages for Amazon warehouse workers. In just 1 year, she said, Amazon operations triggered $221 million in public subsidies, not for innovation, but for cleanup. To cover what they won't. The room remained silent, cameras now whirring in overdrive, tracking her like a trial's closing argument. She turned her body, not facing the screen anymore, but the senators themselves. And let me be crystal clear, these aren't investments. These aren't emergency measures. These are systemic structures, built into the very architecture of our economy, designed to reward corporate giants while shaming working-class parents for needing help. She took a step closer to the bench where Katie Britt sat, her expression unreadable. Jasmine's voice dropped lower now, almost conversational but with a sharp edge. So I asked this committee, and especially Senator Britt, why is it that when a black mother in Alabama asked for $200 to feed her child, she's called a parasite? But when Walmart lets the taxpayer fund its payroll, that's fiscal efficiency? She clicked again. A bar chart exploded onto the screen like a crime scene photo. At the top, corporate tax avoidance. 2023, $1.27 billion. Underneath, federal aid to low-income families. $138 million. Jasmine gestured at it with her open hand. We spend almost 10 times more supporting companies who exploit their own workers than we do helping the people actually suffering. Another beat passed. No one moved. Now her tone sharpened. We shame poor families for needing food. We force them to document every dollar, prove every purchase, explain every mistake. But when billion-dollar companies take our money, we call that business as usual. We let them write off private jets and union-busting lawyers, and no one blinks. She lifted the folder again, slowly this time, and let it rest open on the table before her. This report contains line-item data. It shows which members of Congress approved what credit, which companies lobbied for what exemption, names, dates, signatures. She tapped it twice. So if anyone here wants to claim this is fiction, I'll wait. But be warned, every page in here has receipts. Now Jasmine turned her full body toward Katie Britt. Her stare was not angry. It was surgical. Senator, she began, her voice calm but pulsing with power, you stood here and called a system broken because it helped a poor mother survive. But I want you to help me understand, why is she a drain while Amazon is called a driver of growth? Why is she told to take responsibility while the biggest companies in the world get away with begging the government to subsidize poverty wages they created? The tension in the room became unbearable, like an invisible wire pulled tight, ready to snap. And Jasmine, never breaking eye contact, delivered the final blow with devastating clarity. The truth is, we don't hate handouts. We just like to control who gets them. Then she let it hang. No follow-up, no apology. Just the truth, raw and burning in the open air. A mirror no one wanted to look into, but none could turn away from. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was guilt, cornered by facts. And Jasmine didn't need a gavel or a vote. In that moment, her words were the verdict. As Jasmine's words hung in the air like a slow-burning indictment, not just of policy but of perception, a hush gripped the chamber. Then across the room, Katie Britt shifted forward, not to strike back, but to reach somewhere the numbers couldn't touch. She stood slowly, not with defiance this time, but with something more human, weariness dressed in discipline. Her hands gripped the wooden edge of the lectern, fingers tightening ever so slightly, as if bracing against a truth she hadn't planned to revisit. Her voice, when it finally came, didn't rise. It retreated, quiet, controlled, a small window into a life few in that room could picture. "My mother," she began, her gaze not on Jasmine now, but somewhere inward. "Taught third grade in Wilcox County for 30 years. She used to bring home chalk on her clothes and worry in her eyes. My father worked in a steel plant until a beam snapped and crushed his spine. He never walked again." She paused, not for effect, but because she had to. "I was 12. The words weren't rehearsed. They stumbled out like they'd been waiting for permission. Her eyes scanned the hearing room again, no longer searching for political advantage, but perhaps searching for a little grace. "We lived in a double wide with plastic on the windows to keep out the cold. Dinner was canned spinach and powdered milk. I wore the same 2 pairs of jeans all through high school, patching them myself when they tore." A short laugh escaped. Bitter, nostalgic. "People talk about growing up hard. We grew up with borrowed light bulbs and quiet prayers." Her shoulders rose and fell with a breath that tried to stay composed. "But we didn't ask for help. Not because we were proud. Lord knows we were desperate. But because we believed in the promise that if we worked hard, really hard, we could claw our way out. And eventually we did." Katie's voice firmed as she stepped slightly forward, no longer buried in memory, but rising out of it. "That struggle made me who I am. And I thank God we didn't rely on the government, because it forced me to believe in my own strength, not someone else's permission." The room was silent. No murmurs, no shuffling papers, just the weight of 2 lives now laid bare. Jasmine's defense of systemic victims and Katie's testimony of personal triumph. They weren't just debating policies anymore. They were wrestling with America's soul. "I say this not to dismiss anyone's pain," Katie added, glancing toward Jasmine, but not with spite, "but because I don't want us to build a system where survival is easier than success, where dependency becomes culture, not crisis." Her words didn't land with the force of accusation, but with the ache of experience. The kind of experience that carves a person into something sharp, and sometimes into something blind. There was a ripple of applause, restrained, respectful, not thunderous but genuine. A few nodded along, hands folded, yet others remained completely still, their eyes trained on Jasmine Crockett, waiting. Not because they disrespected Katie's story, but because they sensed it had just become one half of a much larger truth. And as the camera panned across the chamber, what it captured wasn't outrage or unity, but something more fragile and more dangerous. 2 Americas, both wounded, both real, and both unable, in this moment, to look away from each other. Katie's personal testimony had earned its moment of pause, but Jasmine Crockett understood something deeper. Empathy without action was theater, and sometimes a statistic needed a human face. She had come prepared to show one. Jasmine stood without ceremony, the silence around her thick like a storm about to break. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice level, "I request permission to bring forward a witness, someone whose life is not a hypothetical, but a consequence." She motioned toward the rear door. The audience turned, a ripple of curiosity cutting across rows of polished suits and stony expressions. The doors opened. In stepped a man whose presence didn't demand attention, until the pain etched into his posture made it impossible to ignore. Mid-50s, lean, weathered like rusted steel, Daniel Reyes walked with a slight limp, holding a folded cap in both hands like he was afraid to crush it. Or maybe like it was the last thing he owned that hadn't betrayed him. Jasmine moved to his side as he took the witness seat. "This is Daniel Reyes," she began. "He worked at the General Motors plant in Lordstown, Ohio for 27 years. He didn't leave that job. He was abandoned by it. When the plant closed, so did his health insurance, his financial security, and his peace of mind." Daniel cleared his throat. His voice cracked on the first word. "I've never spoken in a room like this. Usually I'm under the hood of a car, not under the lights." He glanced nervously at the cameras. "I built engines, real ones, worked every shift I was given, paid into the system, voted, never asked for more than I gave." He paused, gathering something heavier than his thoughts. Then the cancer hit. Liver, stage 3. Doctors said it wasn't from drinking, said it was probably from chemical exposure at the plant. I applied for Medicaid after my insurance ran out. I couldn't afford the treatments otherwise. His hands tightened around the cap. They denied me, said I had too much. A low stir moved through the room. Jasmine nodded for him to continue. Daniel unfolded a single page from his jacket. It shook in his fingers. This is the letter. Denial of benefits. The reason's right here. Jasmine took it gently, and with a click, the page appeared projected behind them. A red underline cut through the line like a wound. Assets exceed allowable threshold. Beneath it, 1998 Chevrolet Lumina. Estimated value, $1,195. Daniel's voice grew quieter, but somehow heavier. That car, it's how I get to the clinic. It's how I take my wife to her job cleaning floors at the nursing home. They told me to sell it. If I did, we couldn't get to work. I couldn't get to treatment. But they said keeping it made me ineligible. The room, already cold, seemed to freeze. Every word added weight to the silence. I didn't ask for charity. I asked for help so I could keep working, so I could stay alive. And they said no, because I owned a 25-year-old car. His voice caught. What kind of system values a dying man's engine more than his body? Cameras flashed, shutters clicking like gunshots against the stillness. A staffer covered her mouth. Someone in the back muttered, "Jesus," but no one spoke over him. Jasmine stepped forward, now holding the projected letter in her hand. "Let this enter into the official record," she said, voice tight. "This is what disqualification looks like. Not laziness, not fraud. Just an old car and a man who tried to hold on to a little dignity." She turned toward the committee members, but her eyes found Katie Britt. "Senator, earlier you spoke of your childhood, of canned beans and broken windows. You survived hardship and took pride in not needing assistance. I respect that." Jasmine's voice dropped, steady and precise. "But let me ask you, if your father's wheelchair was counted as an asset, if your mother's chalkboard disqualified her from food stamps, would you still believe the system was built to help the righteous and punish the idle?" No answer came. Jasmine wasn't waiting for one. She turned back to Daniel, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You shouldn't be here begging for compassion. You should be home, resting, healing, living whatever life this country still owes you." Daniel nodded, but his face was unreadable, tired, not from the disease, but from the policies that treated it like a transaction. Jasmine raised her voice slightly, enough to shake the walls without shouting. "We say we honor workers, that we value families, that no one should have to choose between medicine and transportation, between dignity and eligibility. But this document says otherwise. This is the fine print of injustice." The room had gone fully still. No papers rustled, no aides whispered. Every pair of eyes was locked either on the man in the witness chair or on the quiet fury building in the congresswoman beside him. Jasmine leaned forward, placing the denial letter on the table as if it were evidence in a criminal trial. "If anyone here believes that a man with cancer should sell the car that keeps his wife employed just to qualify for basic care, say so. Now." No one did, and in that silence, Daniel Reyes sat surrounded by lawmakers, cameras, and microphones. Yet he had never felt more invisible, until Jasmine Crockett made sure the whole nation saw him. And they did. The room had already felt the weight of suffering through Daniel Reyes's trembling voice. But Jasmine Crockett knew one final blade needed to fall, not from a broken man, but from the lips of the powerful when they thought no one was listening. She didn't rise this time. She didn't have to. Jasmine Crockett's hand moved with surgical precision as she reached into a slim folder and retrieved a small, unmarked flash drive. She placed it on the table like a live grenade. "Mr. Chairman," she said calmly, though every word pulsed with restrained fire, "before we close this hearing, I ask the committee to listen to a brief internal audio recording obtained under whistleblower protections. This is not public testimony. This is private strategy." There was a pause. Murmurs flickered across the chamber like shadows from a passing storm. The chair nodded. A technician accepted the drive, plugged it into the system, and without any fanfare, the voice began. It wasn't the tone of a politician. It was cleaner, smoother, the kind of voice that spends more time in boardrooms than on ballots. We've run the numbers, the voice said, measured and confident. When benefit levels rise above certain thresholds, labor force participation drops. People wait longer to take jobs. They negotiate harder. That makes lower-tier employers less competitive. So yes, we recommend tightening benefit eligibility to reinforce labor elasticity. The words were bloodless, but the next sentence hit like a whip crack. If the poor aren't hurting, they won't work. Pain is an economic lever. A ripple passed through the audience, almost imperceptible. But Jasmine felt it, the slow, dawning horror. One congressman's pen dropped and clattered to the floor. A few aides exchanged glances, unsure whether to keep typing or simply sit in the moment. Jasmine rose, slowly, deliberately. Her hands were calm, but her gaze was fire. She looked not at the chairman, not at the cameras, but directly at Katie Britt. That wasn't a lobbyist, she said, voice clear as a knife slicing through smoke. That wasn't a political enemy. That was one of our own federal advisors, paid with your tax dollars, sitting in a room, behind closed doors, deciding how much suffering is economically efficient. The room remained silent, yet everything felt louder. The breath of the staffer 2 rows behind, the hum of fluorescent lights, the recording still frozen on the screen behind her. Jasmine stepped forward toward the witness table, then turned back to face the full chamber. This isn't about fraud, she said. This isn't about lazy people gaming the system. This is about a cold, calculated philosophy that says unless people are desperate, they're useless to the economy, that hunger creates obedience, that suffering is strategy. She walked over to the screen and pointed at the transcript, now projected in bold type. Pain is an economic lever. That, she said, voice trembling, not with weakness, but with tightly coiled rage, is not economics. That is moral rot. It is cruelty with a diploma. Katie Britt remained still. Her hands, once folded tightly in front of her, now trembled ever so slightly on the desk. She didn't look up. Whether it was guilt or just the realization that the curtain had been yanked back too far, too fast, no one could say. Jasmine returned to the microphone, her voice now quieter. But in that quiet was something lethal. We call them benefits, but what they are lifelines. And now you've heard it from the architects. Not only do they withhold them, they weaponize the withholding. They create policies that punish people for surviving, and they justify it by pretending it's a meritocracy. She paused. Her next words came slowly, as if each syllable had to be pulled through centuries of injustice. This is not policy. This is not fiscal responsibility. This is budgetary torture. The sentence fell like a gavel slamming down, not from the chairman's hand, but from a reckoning far larger. A cameraman coughed, but even the sound seemed distant. No one else moved. No one dared to, because Jasmine hadn't just exposed a broken system. She had exposed the intent behind it, the ideology that made it broken by design. And in that silence, Jasmine Crockett didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stood still in the eye of the storm she had summoned, while the rest of the room wrestled with the truth they could no longer unhear. The budget had always been a battlefield, but now the weapons had names, and Jasmine had just forced them all into the light. The chamber remained heavy with the weight of revelations. Jasmine's words had pierced the veneer of policy debates, exposing the raw nerves of a system fraught with inequity. Now all eyes turned to Senator Katie Britt, awaiting her response. Senator Katie Britt sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly on the desk before her. The silence stretched, each second amplifying the tension in the room. She inhaled deeply, her shoulders rising as she summoned the strength to speak. Her gaze, once steely and unyielding, now reflected a storm of emotions, conflict, realization, and a hint of vulnerability. I came into this chamber with convictions, she began, her voice steady but subdued. Beliefs forged from personal experience, from a life where hard work was the currency of survival. She paused, her eyes scanning the faces before her. My mother was a teacher. My father, after his accident, could no longer provide. We lived modestly, relying on canned goods in the hope that tomorrow would be kinder. She leaned forward slightly, her hands unfolding as if releasing a burden. I believe that resilience was the antidote to hardship, that government assistance, while necessary, should be a temporary bridge, not a permanent crutch. Her voice faltered for a moment, the weight of the previous testimonies pressing upon her. But today, she continued, her tone tinged with introspection, I've been confronted with narratives that challenge that belief. Stories of individuals who, despite their best efforts, find themselves ensnared in a system that seems more punitive than supportive. She glanced at Jasmine, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. I want to believe that our system can be both robust and compassionate, she said, her voice gaining strength. But perhaps today, I've glimpsed its harsher realities. She concluded, her words hanging in the air, a testament to a mind in transition. The room remained silent, the gravity of her admission settling over the assembly. Jasmine Crockett, seated across from her, did not applaud nor smile. Instead, she inclined her head slightly, her expression solemn. Sometimes, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of truth, a nation doesn't need more money. It needs more heart. The chamber held its breath, the exchange between the two women transcending political lines, touching the core of shared humanity. The chamber remained heavy with the weight of revelations. Jasmine's words had pierced the veneer of policy debates, exposing the raw nerves of a system fraught with inequity. Now all eyes turned to Senator Katie Britt, awaiting her response. Senator Katie Britt sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly on the desk before her. The silence stretched, each second amplifying the tension in the room. She inhaled deeply, her shoulders rising as she summoned the strength to speak. Her gaze, once steely and unyielding, now reflected a storm of emotions. Conflict, realization, and a hint of vulnerability. I came into this chamber with convictions, she began, her voice steady but subdued. Beliefs forged from personal experience, from a life where hard work was the currency of survival. She paused, her eyes scanning the faces before her. My mother was a teacher. My father, after his accident, could no longer provide. We lived modestly, relying on canned goods and the hope that tomorrow would be kinder. She leaned forward slightly, her hands unfolding as if releasing a burden. I believe that resilience was the antidote to hardship, that government assistance, while necessary, should be a temporary bridge, not a permanent crutch. Her voice faltered for a moment, the weight of the previous testimonies pressing upon her. But today, she continued, her tone tinged with introspection, I've been confronted with narratives that challenge that belief. Stories of individuals who, despite their best efforts, find themselves ensnared in a system that seems more punitive than supportive. She glanced at Jasmine, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. I want to believe that our system can be both robust and compassionate, she said, her voice gaining strength. But perhaps today I've glimpsed its harsher realities. She concluded, her words hanging in the air, a testament to a mind in transition. The room remained silent, the gravity of her admission settling over the assembly. Jasmine Crockett, seated across from her, did not applaud nor smile. Instead, she inclined her head slightly, her expression solemn. Sometimes, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of truth, a nation doesn't need more money, it needs more heart. The chamber held its breath, the exchange between the two women transcending political lines, touching the core of shared humanity. The hush that followed the hearing's adjournment still clung to the marble walls like an aftershock, and as the final echo of gavels faded into hushed whispers, Jasmine Crockett pushed through the heavy bronze doors, carrying with her the unseen weight of testimony, exposed cruelty, and the faintest hum of possibility, the kind of atmosphere that makes even the drizzle outside feel electric with consequence, so that the moment she stepped beneath the Capitol portico, the gray sky seemed to bow, unleashing a soft, needling rain that fluttered against her coat and turned every stone step into a mirror for the lights behind her. Cameras sprang to life beneath a canopy of umbrellas, their red tally lamps blinking like warning beacons amid the downpour, and reporters jostled for position, heels scraping wet granite, microphones thrust forward through the curtain of water, while aides scrambled to keep folders dry. all of them hungry for one last sound bite to frame the chaotic artistry of the day's revelations. The numbers, the tears, the stunned silence in which an entire committee had realized the ledger of American morality was written in red ink. A young journalist in a rumpled Navy suit managed to wedge himself to the front, rain streaking down his glasses, voice quivering with a mixture of ambition and genuine urgency, and his question sliced through the patter of water on nylon. Congresswoman, if the bill stalls, if the Senate buries it in committee, if the votes vanish the way so many promises have, what then? What do you say to people who believe today might finally change something? Jasmine paused mid-stride, the glow of a street lamp cutting a pale halo around the steam rising from the Capitol grounds. And for a heartbeat, she let the storm speak. The hiss of tires on slick asphalt, the distant clap of thunder, the fragile chorus of protesters still camped beyond the barricades, while inside her chest the day rewound in jagged flashes. Daniel Reyes clutching a denial letter, May Turner counting pills she could not afford, a roomful of lawmakers blinking away the sting of an inconvenient truth they could no longer unsee. She pivoted slowly, rain tracing silver rivulets along the contours of her cheeks, meeting the reporter's eyes with a gaze tempered by resolve and fatigue, a gaze that held both the fire of righteous anger and the steadiness of a surgeon's hand. And she understood in that instant that her answer would be carried far beyond this curb, into living rooms and break rooms and overnight shifts where faith in government had been starved for decades. Her voice, when it emerged, did not soar or tremble. It rolled out low and certain, each syllable honed by countless town hall nights and courthouse mornings. I don't write legislation to chase polling numbers, she said, the words cutting through the rain like a clean blade. I draft these pages so that the next Daniel, the next May, the next child wondering where dinner will come from, will not have to bargain with their dignity just to stay alive. The line struck with a physical force. Microphones tilted forward, camera shutters fluttered like startled birds, and social media feeds all over the city lit up as if someone had flipped a switch. Yet Jasmine scarcely noticed the frenzy because she saw something else ignite. A flicker of surprise in the reporter's expression, the silent gratitude of an older nurse at the barricade clutching a handmade sign, the quick nod of a freshman congresswoman who had listened from the doorway and realized politics could still sound like humanity. Turning away, Jasmine descended the Capitol steps, shoes splashing in shallow puddles that reflected the dome, now shimmering beneath rain-blurred floodlights. And each footfall felt like planting a flag on a battlefield where victories are measured less by headlines than by smaller, harder arithmetic. The prescription filled, the eviction stayed, the job that finally pays for both rent and breakfast. Yet tonight, even the weight of failure could not crush the fierceness of that mathematics, because every droplet soaking her coat was a reminder that seeds do not bloom beneath clear skies. They need storms. Behind her, the reporter scrambled to file his clip. Staffers debated damage control. Lobbyists refreshed spreadsheets. But none of their murmurings could drown the murmur now spreading through the crowd. An almost imperceptible rhythm, part hope, part defiance, like the first dangerous beat of a march swelling in the darkness. Because something in the cadence of Jasmine's promise had pierced the cynicism that usually shields the powerful, and people who had come to expect little from Congress suddenly felt the stir of a different expectation, that perhaps conscience could be coaxed into policy. On the sidewalk, she paused beneath a lone magnolia, its blossoms bruised by rain yet still fragrant, and she looked back one last time at the pillars where arguments had collided with truths, at the cameras still hunting for spectacle, then lifted her chin into the drizzle. In the hush that followed, her closing words lingered like an ember against the chill night air. No campaign slogan, no partisan flourish, simply a credo forged in witness. We don't need a richer ledger, she whispered to herself, the rain swallowing her voice yet carrying its spirit outward. We need a country where balance is measured by mercy. The rain-streaked steps behind her disappeared into night, yet every silver droplet on Jasmine's coat kept whispering the same question. What lasting human lesson can survive the storm of politics? The first lesson begins with scale. with the realization that a single denial letter or a single empty lunchbox is never isolated. Each is a tremor in a larger seismic field of neglect. And once you feel those vibrations, you cannot pretend the fault line is someone else's problem. You learn that spreadsheets lie by omission, that averages conceal agony, and that entire communities can be rendered invisible by the placement of a decimal. The moral terrain tilts beneath your feet when you understand how quickly dignity can be repossessed, how easily a 20-year-old sedan becomes an unacceptable luxury, and how effortlessly a child's hunger is rebranded as parental failure. Jasmine's journey teaches that moral arithmetic is ruthless when performed by those who will never pay the interest on deprivation. She shows that the distance between comfort and collapse can be bridged by something as trivial as a worn-out timing belt or a medical code on the wrong line of a form. The human lesson, then, is that fragility is universal even when suffering is not evenly distributed, and any policy built on the assumption of unbreakable citizens is a blueprint for societal fracture. It is here that the injustice hits hardest, because the people drafting the rules are protected by benefits no application can deny, and by safety nets stitched from influence rather than thread. The lesson crystallizes: systems favor those already standing on marble floors, while blaming those forced to tread water for not climbing fast enough. A second lesson arrives in the hush after the camera's cut, when the echo of testimony reverberates through hallways that smell of waxed stone and old ambition, and Jasmine's footsteps teach that silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of choice. When legislators fall quiet, that hush can signal reckoning or retreat, and it is the citizen's task to decide which. The scene where Daniel's voice cracked is now replayed in break rooms and late-night radio, and every listener is invited to measure the gap between his decades of labor and the system's clinical disregard. That gulf is the birthplace of empathy, but empathy without motion decays into voyeurism. So the real instruction is to turn witness into will. Jasmine's unflinching stance before wealth-forged power reminds any bystander that emotional courage often begins where political convenience ends. It is a call to expose the distance between the rhetoric of merit and the reality of rigged ladders, a demand to count the hands reaching upward rather than the dollars trickling down. Her persistence reveals that true representation is less about echoing a district's demographics and more about echoing its unspoken dread of being written off the national ledger. She proves a single uncompromised voice can flood a soundproof room, and that lesson is both invitation and warning. Speak or be measured only by the silence you allow. The third human lesson is carved from the clash of personal narrative versus institutional narrative, illustrated when Katie's childhood of canned beans was laid beside May Turner's pharmacy receipt, and suddenly adversity stopped being a badge of honor and became a continuum of hazard. It shows that two truths can coexist while canceling no pain. One woman climbed without aid, another is being buried by a ladder of paperwork, and both stories demand different remedies. Jasmine forces the nation to admit that bootstrap myths become weapons when wielded against those whose boots were repossessed. The moral takeaway is that anecdotes can illuminate, but never exonerate. A single escape from poverty cannot justify building higher walls around the exit. Justice requires systems that flex for the fragile instead of fortifying the fortunate. And policies must be drafted not to punish hardship, but to outpace it. This lesson pulses through every gasping pause of the hearing. Personal grit is heroic. Systemic grit is barbaric. To honor resilience, one must first remove the grindstone, or else applause becomes complicity. Jasmine's stare across the aisle teaches that empathy divorced from policy is a sermon to a locked church. The injustice she confronts is that survivors are applauded on stages built from the planks of those still drowning. A fourth lesson thrums in the low vocals of that leaked recording, where a faceless strategist describes suffering as an economic lever, revealing that cruelty can be coded into guidelines more subtly than any slur, and yet cut deeper. The immediate human insight is that sanitized language often conceals lethal intent. Bureaucratic diction can starve as effectively as overt malice. That moment exposes how moral injury is inflicted not only with hateful speech, but with neutral memos stipulating cost containment. By playing that clip, Jasmine taught an advanced course in ethical translation. Convert the cold calculus back into the body heat it extinguishes. The lesson urges citizens to interrogate every euphemism: labor elasticity, market discipline, asset threshold, because behind each phrase may sit an unacknowledged corpse of opportunity. The cinematic tension here is the revelation that villains do not always twirl mustaches. Sometimes they balance budgets. Jasmine's quiet condemnation, budgetary torture, is a line that should reverberate through every fiscal meeting henceforth, a moral watermark against which all future policies must be held. The injustice at stake is slow violence, bloodless yet relentless, and her lesson is that ignoring it is a partisan luxury humanity cannot afford. A fifth lesson emerges in the collective response, when over 1,200 nurses and teachers sign their names beneath a letter that reads like a battlefield triage report for democracy. We see the need daily. People need rescuing, not vetting. Their signatures transform individual outrage into communal force, proving solidarity is not a hashtag but a muscle that must be exercised under stress. The nurses know the pulse of desperation better than any economist. The teachers can trace poverty's graph in the lunchroom lines long before it appears in quarterly data. Their chorus teaches that policy expertise without frontline testimony is a blunt instrument, and frontline testimony without policy follow-through is a lullaby for the comfortable. When their letter floods inboxes on the Hill, it becomes a diagnostic chart for the body politic, showing precisely where compassion is hemorrhaging. That convergence of professions, caregivers of body and mind, signals a new metric of national health: whether children can learn without hunger pains, whether patients can heal without bankruptcy. Jasmine's struggle reached them not because it was sensational, but because it was familiar. And the lesson is that familiarity with injustice must become a catalyst, not a sedative. The injustice here is that those who understand necessity best are often granted the least authority to define it. A sixth lesson surfaces in the rain itself, that cinematic drizzle enveloping Jasmine as she descends the stairs, illustrating that aftermaths are rarely triumphant. They are damp, heavy, and unresolved. The droplets ticking against her umbrella echo the ticking of legislative clocks, and each whisper reminds her that momentum dies quickly in dry rooms. Yet the drizzle also baptizes the promise, washing away the dust of committee stalls, allowing seeds of outrage to sink into fertile soil. The lesson lies in motion. Justice requires walking into storms rather than waiting for clear skies. By pausing to answer the reporter, Jasmine performs another act of teaching. Courage is quieter than applause and louder than surrender. Her refusal to package her fight as a campaign slogan signals that authenticity is the last untarnished currency in an over-leveraged democracy. The injustice she faces is the inertia waiting to congeal once cameras power down. Her remedy is to keep citizens' pulse rates elevated long enough to outlive that inertia. She shows that every raindrop on her coat is a fast-fading headline unless it lands on kindling hearts. The seventh and final lesson is embedded in her reply, 9 words that ricochet across airwaves. I don't write laws to win votes. I write them so people don't lose at life. This line reframes legislative purpose from a scoreboard to a lifeline, charging every future bill with the obligation to redistribute not just resources, but risk. The lesson insists that the success of a nation is measured not by GDP, but by the gap between catastrophe and recovery for its most vulnerable. Its cinematic force lies in its universality. Any viewer, regardless of party, can imagine a sudden fall, an illness, a layoff, a flood, and understand that the ground they land on is poured by policy. Jasmine converts that anxiety into agency, turning fear of loss into fuel for change, and that transformation is the highest art of leadership. She demonstrates that injustice thrives in the space where empathy evaporates, and the antidote is legislation infused with lived reality. Her closing words convert moral witness into marching orders. Draft laws as if your own heartbeat depends on them. The injustice she challenges is complacency. The lesson she leaves is vigilance. And as she walks into the rain-washed night, her silhouette becomes less a lone figure than the first line of a human ledger finely balanced in favor of mercy rather than margin. Yet if the lessons carved into that storm-lit hearing are to matter beyond the Capitol steps, they must detonate into movement. So hear this call not as rhetoric, but as a flare. You who watch Daniel's fingers shake around a cancer denial letter. You who teach children whose stomachs drown out algebra. You whose stethoscope catches the hollow thud of unpaid fear. Step forward now, because the architects of complacency are counting on your exhaustion. Flood every congressional inbox with stories sharp enough to slice through boilerplate replies. Jam every phone line until aides hear a chorus of unpaid rent notices and unfilled prescriptions, and don't apologize for the volume. Polite desperation is a lobbyist's favorite lullaby, so make your demand loud enough to rattle the brass nameplates off committee doors. Print May Turner's $2,173 pharmacy bill on posters, tape them to town hall walls, and dare any lawmaker to walk past without signing a promise to fix it. Nurses wheel towers of redacted patient charts into the rotunda until case numbers eclipse the dome. Teachers unspool cafeteria debt ledgers across marble floors so the echo of every empty lunch tray reverberates under chandeliers bought with corporate tax breaks. When lobbyists slip through side entrances whispering about market efficiency, meet them with crowds brandishing flashlights and camera phones, turning their jargon into a public confession. Let every hallway where deals trade hands in the dark drown in daylight and witnesses. Turn the ballot box into a battleground where candidates must declare whether poverty is a policy choice or a natural disaster. And remember, silence on that question is an endorsement of the latter. Hijack the hashtags that sell sneakers and streaming shows, rename them after Medicaid rejection codes and eviction docket numbers, and prove that trending topics become torches when enough hands lift them. Tell every neighbor the national budget isn't a ledger, but a life support monitor. If the vital signs flatline, blame falls on anyone who looked away when the alarm first beeped. March right, donate, strike, and vote as though defending your own future hospital bed, your own child's report card, because in an economy that puts a price on compassion, the invoice will eventually reach every doorstep. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.